Hey everybody, this is chapter 2 of Anton Pannekoek and the Socialism of Workers' Self-Emancipation, 1873 to 1960 by John Gerber. Chapter 2 is titled Mind and Reality, Pannekoek's Methodology, and it has the headings Pannekoek and Dietzgen, the Dialectics of Distinction, Theory and Social Development, the Class Basis of Science, Social Knowledge of a New Kind, Pannekoek's Conception of Historical Materialism. Here we go. Chapter 2, Mind and Reality, Pannekoek's Methodology. First section, Pannekoek and Dietzgen, the Dialectics of Distinction. Pannekoek's early years in Leiden also coincided with his rapid emergence as a prominent theoretician of Dutch Marxism. Shortly after becoming a Marxist in 1899, Pannekoek began a prolonged theoretical inquiry into the nature of Marxism as a method of human social transformation. His first major project was an extensive study of Marxist economics made in collaboration with Frank van der Goes. Dissatisfied with what he perceived to be the determinism inherent in Marxist economics, and hoping to develop a scientific framework for analyzing the relationship of human consciousness and action to the material world, Pannekoek went on in 1900 to a systematic study of the philosophical basis of Marxism, starting with an examination of the relationship between Marxism and Kantianism. Shortly afterwards, Pannekoek discovered the writings of the German worker philosopher Joseph Dietzgen, which marked the decisive turning point in his theoretical development. Through his study of Dietzgen, Pannekoek developed the key philosophical and scientific concepts upon which he built his Marxism, and which he retained with only slight revision and reformation throughout the different phases of his political career. Like Pannekoek, I think it's probably Joseph Dietzgen, who lived from 1828 to 1888, has remained a largely neglected theorist who was once widely known and respected. A tanner and autodidact with little more than an elementary school education, Dietzgen had been active in the socialist movement in both Europe and the United States. At the Hague Congress of the First International, Marx introduced Dietzgen as, quote, our philosopher. Although critical of certain aspects of Dietzgen's work, Marx pronounced it, quote, excellent and as the independent product of a working man, admirable, end quote, Marx. Engels, in the book Ludwig Feuerbach, subsequently credited Dietzgen somewhat loosely in view of their different conceptions with the independent discovery of the materialist dialectic. In his extensive efforts to elaborate a specifically, quote, proletarian philosophy, end quote, Dietzgen's writings were deeply infused with the spirit of working-class autodidacticism, in which the enthusiasm for ideas was often combined with a reluctance to develop them in a systematic manner. It was this aspect of Dietzgen's work, coupled with his often rough, abrupt, and repetitive language, which accounts for the skepticism and indifference his ideas met in intellectual circles. This indifference, however, was partly offset by the popular vogue his writing later enjoyed among many rank-and-file working-class militants during the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Dietzgen considered himself essentially a philosopher of science and sought to develop an inductive methodology for attaining a comprehensive view of the world for the purpose of prediction and control. From a philosophical standpoint, Dietzgen's main aim was to bridge the dualism of thought and reality, a task inherited from the German classical tradition, and specifically from Feuerbach, of whom Dietzgen was initially a disciple and a correspondent. Dietzgen held that this duality could only be bridged by a philosophy that was inductive and identified with natural science. In keeping with this aim, Dietzgen rejected the greater part of the Hegelian system on the basis of its non-inductive character. On the most general level, Dietzgen sought to establish 1. The objective reality and unity of both the natural and social processes, 2. The relative and tentative validity of all knowledge obtained about these processes, and 3. The unity of human activity, particularly thought activity, with the natural and social environment and its importance as a factor conditioning it. From this point of departure, Dietzgen developed his system along 5 main lines: a theory of knowledge and cognition, a theory of philosophy and philosophy's dissolution, a theory of science and its formation, a theory of, quote, proletarian logic, and a theory of, quote, practical ethics. The most original characteristic of Dietzgen's philosophy was his attempt to develop a scientific and materialistic theory of understanding, The human thought process, he felt, was as accessible to scientific analysis and elaboration as any other natural or social process. Quote, if we could place this general work of thinking on a scientific basis, if we could develop a method by which truth is produced scientifically, then we should acquire for science in general and for our individual faculty of judgment the same certainty of success which we already possess in special fields of science. End quote. Dietzgen. From a political standpoint, Dietzgen envisioned his theory of understanding as an active element in the continuous transformation of mind and matter and an indispensable intellectual tool for proletarian self-emancipation. Dietzgen's first and best-known study, titled The Nature of Human Brainwork, from 1869, represents his most systematic effort to formulate an inductive theory of cognition, starting from a detailed critique of Kantian dualism and its separation of the material world from the world of thought. Dietzgen attempted to affirm the unity and dynamic interconnection of all things material and non-material. In Dietzgen's conception, the world was viewed as a process of continuous formation, conflict, and interaction. From his perspective, all forms of natural and human phenomena were organized into complex systems of circular causality, with multiple and interlocking relationships, each part of which could be explained only as a product of its relations with the other parts. What this meant for Dietzgen's theory of understanding was that the, quote, real world was composed of an infinite and continuously changing number of sense-perceptible qualities whose interdependence unites them into an integrated totality. The human mind, he felt, in its interaction with its environment, attempts to generalize particular combinations of sense perception into mental concepts. A concept of thought, like everything else in the universe, is therefore composed of many different parts. It arises from the relation between a thinking brain and the object about which the brain thinks, and is as much a product of the object as it is of the thinking process. The key element in the formation of conceptual thought, Dietzgen insisted, was the process by which the mind abstracts the particular qualities from the general qualities in various objects of thought and attempts to classify them into different systems. According to Dietzgen, the senses perceive an endless stream of phenomena, and the role of the mind as the organ of human understanding is to make sense of this data by distinguishing and naming parts of it. What actually occurs in this division and classification process is the construction of units of a particular type on the basis of similar characteristics which are then labeled with a name. Explaining this principle, Dietzgen noted that a table, for instance, does not have an independent existence of its own, but is simply a name given by the mind to a recurring type of phenomena perceived by the senses. It is an abstraction, a mental construct that becomes separate from the whole only by the act of conceptualization. Dietzgen, at the same time, resolutely maintained that these conceptualizations were not purely mental constructs in the idealist sense, but were in fact abstractions derived from perceptions of an objectively existing external reality. The mind was not so much constructing the external world as reconstructing an image of it. In attempting to draw out the implications of this for human activity, Dietzgen argued that conceptualization defines the precise categories by which the world is viewed and acted upon. In the process described by Dietzgen, the world is seen as a continuous flow of events in which individuals play an integral part by utilizing their minds to sort out these events, distinguishing among them, generalize from them, and act on the basis of their conclusions. Dietzgen considered this classification and abstraction process to be dialectical in the way that it mediates distinctions and differences in a particular object of thought. As a dialectical process, thought recognizes that all things simultaneously form parts of other things, and at the same time change into other things, which require different names or descriptions. For Dietzgen, dialectic did not necessarily mean absolute opposites or contradictions. In Dietzgen's view, contradictions exist only through the mental separation of the component parts of a particular object of thought. Without this mental act, there could be no contradiction. The mind merely constructs them and makes them equal, as part of the classification and systematization process. Dietzgen treated as axiomatic that no form of knowledge can ever be regarded as absolute, but only as a tentative approximation of reality, subject to revision on the basis of further experience. All truths as part of the world were only partial truths. Truth and error flow into each other dialectically. Quote, truths are valid only under certain conditions, and under conditions errors may be true. End quote. In Dietzgen's view, a perfect truth could only be one which is based on a recognition of imperfection. In defining the relation of thought to the material world, Dietzgen stressed repeatedly that there was no such thing as a rigid distinction between mind and matter. In his view, they were merely names to distinguish between two different things, but since the names were abstractions derived from phenomena, they were not identical with the things. For Dietzgen, the point to be emphasized was that mind and matter represented two key aspects of nature, artificially separated by mental classification, only because no name had been developed to cover both terms. Dietzgen expanded this analysis into a critique of what he termed, quote, mechanical materialism, end quote. The view that the world is composed of tiny particles of matter, and that thought is the product of the movement of these particles. Such a narrow conception of materialism, he argued, wholly misunderstands the nature of the problem. It fails to take into consideration the fact that parts of the world do not exist separately, but only as interconnected parts of the whole. Matter, in the sense of tangible material, does not possess the slightest preferential right to be considered more important and more distinct than any other phenomena of nature. To isolate one part of the universe and make it the basis of all other parts, Dietzgen felt, was to ascribe an independent existence to what is essentially an abstraction. Only the complete world of phenomena itself, the universe in its entirety, has a separate independent existence of its own. Dietzgen, however, made it clear that his hypothesis did not rule out a scientific explanation of the world based on the movement of atoms. In a passage that broadly anticipates the theoretical course of modern physics, he noted, quote, atoms are groups. As small as parts they exist only in our thoughts and thus give excellent service in chemistry. The consciousness that they are not tangible, but only mental things, does not detach from their usefulness, but heightens it still more. End quote. Dietzgen. Although Dietzgen's system, like Marx's, aimed at understanding and transforming the world on the basis of the social division of labor, he never managed to work out the political and social implications of his theories. The task of establishing the relationship between Marx and Dietzgen thus fell upon Pannekoek. For Pannekoek, the discovery of Dietzgen provided a critical link between Marxism and his professional role as a natural scientist. Quote, here I found for the first time everything that I had been looking for, a clear systematic elaboration of a theory of knowledge and an analysis of the nature of concepts and abstractions, ... Through this reading, I was able to completely clarify my conception of the mutual relationship between Marxism and a theory of knowledge and develop it into a unified whole, end quote. Dietzgen's theory of understanding, Pannekoek felt, had the potential to serve as the philosophical basis of not only Marxism but also of the natural sciences. Following an intensive study of Dietzgen's writings, Pannekoek embarked on a lengthy effort to integrate Dietzgen's doctrines into the theory and practice of the socialist movement. Pannekoek began this effort in 1901 with his first major work as a Marxist, an essay on Kant's philosophy and Marxism, in which he counterposed Dietzgen's, quote, proletarian philosophy to the neo-Kantian philosophy of the revisionists. The analysis was broadened the following year when Pannekoek made contact with Dietzgen's son, Eugen, and journeyed to Germany to discuss with him ways of popularizing the elder Dietzgen's ideas. At Eugen Dietzgen's request, Pannekoek agreed to write an introduction to a collection of Joseph Dietzgen's writings. Two goals dominated Pannekoek's thinking in these early reflections on Dietzgen. On the one hand, he sought to establish Dietzgen's place in the history of philosophy and socialist thought and show the practical significance of his dialectics from proletarian emancipation. On the other, he sought to give Marxism a firmer methodological grounding as a counterweight to metaphysical ideologies. In Pannekoek's view, Marx had elaborated only on the nature of the social process of production and its fundamental significance for social development, without really concerning himself with the question of the human, quote, spirit, or Geist. Footnote. Although the word, quote, geistig might best translate as, quote, mental, Pannekoek in his own English writings specifically chose the term, quote, spiritual. By spiritual, he meant a combination of subjective, mental, intellectual, psychological, and moral qualities. End footnote. Other than to show that it derived... Sorry, let me repeat that sentence because it was kind of like the footnote was interrupted the sentence. So, in Pannekoek's view, Marx had elaborated only on the nature of the social process of production and its fundamental significance for social development without really concerning himself with the question of human, quote, spirit, other than to show that it derived its content from the material world. The question thus remained open: what was the exact content of human consciousness, and what was its real relation to the material world? This gap in Marxian theory, Pannekoek felt, coupled with the tradition or influence exercised by bourgeois thought, was one of the main reasons for the erroneous understanding of Marxism by anti-Marxists and revisionists alike. Dietzgen, by making the human mind the special subject of his investigation, and attempting to show the exact content of the process of human consciousness, had made a major contribution towards filling this gap. Pannekoek declared that, for this reason, Dietzgen's theory of understanding constituted the, quote, essence of foundation of Marx's theory of society and man, end quote. Pannekoek. By constructing out of philosophy a, quote, science of the human spirit, end quote, Dietzgen, quote, raised philosophy to the position of a natural science, the same as Marx did with history, end quote. Pannekoek. For this achievement, Dietzgen could be ranked, quote, third among the founders of, quote, socialist science, end quote, next to Marx and Engels, end quote. Pannekoek. As a result, Pannekoek contended that, quote, a thorough study of Dietzgen's writings is an immediate necessity for anyone desiring to learn the philosophical fundamentals of Marxism and the proletarian outlook on life, end quote. Pannekoek. To lend additional credence to his assessment of Dietzgen, Pannekoek also attempted to render a critical and dynamic account of the development of, quote, proletarian philosophy itself, using both Dietzgenian and Marxist categories of analysis. The first stage in this process, he maintained, began with Kant. The significance of Kantian philosophy was twofold. It was at once the, quote, purest expression of bourgeois thought, end quote, and a precursor of modern socialist philosophy. Since, quote, freedom of production, competition, and exploitation were all at the heart of the developing capitalism of the late 18th and early 19th century, Kant's emphasis on, quote, freedom and, quote, free will corresponded to the needs and aspirations of a rising bourgeoisie. By challenging the mechanistic materialism of the French rationalists, Kant also provided a firmer foundation for religious belief, yet clearing the way for a revised form of faith and freedom of the will. Yet in focusing on sensory experience and on the organization of the human mind, Kant made the first valuable contribution to a scientific theory of understanding and human causation, which was a necessary component of any proletarian philosophy. Pannekoek argued that a second stage in the development of a scientific theory of understanding came with Hegel. In strictly social terms, Hegel's thought was the product of the reaction against both bourgeois society and bourgeois philosophy that developed after the French Revolution. Historically, Hegel's attempt to develop a practical critique of bourgeois philosophy as but one part of a larger intellectual effort to provide a theoretical justification of the Restoration. Stripped of its social origins and transcendental character, the real significance of Hegelian philosophy lay in the fact that it provided an excellent theory of the human mind and its working methods. Quote, the vicissitudes of the absolute spirit in the course of its self-development are but a fantastical description of the process which the real human mind experiences in its acquaintance with the world and its active participation in life. Instead of the evolution of the absolute idea, the dialectics henceforth becomes the sole correct method of thought to be employed by the real human mind in the study of the actual world and for the purpose of understanding social development. This quality of Hegel's work, however, could not be fully appreciated until Dietzgen had created the basis for a dialectical and materialist theory of understanding. Like Dietzgen, Pannekoek was quick to reject Hegel's doctrine of knowledge and absolute truth, and to question the direct applicability of Hegelian methodology to Marxism. Quote, the Hegelian garb in which Marx and Engels clothed their philosophical ideas, and, quote, Pannekoek charged, quote, makes it very difficult for modern people to grasp the underlying principles, end quote, of Marxism. The conclusion that Pannekoek drew from his analysis was that the, quote, idealist philosophical systems from Kant to Hegel, which consist chiefly of the development of the dialectical method, must be regarded as the indispensable pioneers and precursors of Dietzgen's proletarian philosophy, end quote. Pannekoek. The previous systems, far from being useless speculations, were ascending stages of understanding, characterized by increasing truth and decreasing error. As an intellectual process, Dietzgen's systems represented the, quote, scientific continuation of former philosophies, just as astronomy is the continuation of astrology, and the Pythagorean fantasies, and chemistry the continuation of alchemy, end quote. Dietzgen, therefore, quote, completed the work of Kant, just as Marx completed the work of Adam Smith, end quote. Dietzgen's philosophy, moreover, was neither, quote, his philosophy nor a new system of philosophy, but merely one of the more systematic intellectual components of the historical mode of abstraction of a rising working class. Although Dietzgen's, quote, proletarian philosophy, end quote, was a direct and logical successor to previous bourgeois philosophical systems, it differed fundamentally from them in the sense that it sought to be less. Whereas earlier philosophical systems pretended to give absolute truth, Dietzgen offered only a finite and temporary realization of truth, which could be further perfected only through the course of social development. Dietzgen's methodology, Pannekoek felt, signified, quote, the completion and conclusion of philosophy, which is equivalent to saying that philosophy as such passes out of existence, while its place is taken by the science of the human mind, a part of natural science, end quote. Pannekoek. New section, Theory and Social Development, the class basis of science. Following his intensive study of Dietzgen, Pannekoek began a new period of inquiry into the relationship between Marxism and science, which he hoped would establish a more authentically scientific basis for Marxism. His starting point was a detailed examination of the role of science in social development. Pannekoek directed his inquiry on two levels: an examination of the methods, meanings, and objects of inquiry behind scientific knowledge, and an analysis of the origins and position of science in human social and mental activity. Taking as his point of departure Dietzgen's theory of understanding, Pannekoek argued that scientific thought was characterized by a process of systematization, conceptualization, and practice. From this standpoint, the goal of science is to find the knowledge that explains existing relationships in such a way as to enable one to predict change and control them. While facts represent the basis of science, facts alone do not form a science. Science is the systematization of facts into general conceptions and rules within a world structure suitable for the computation and prediction of future events. In a conception which bears many similarities to the later, quote, scientific realism of Roy Bhaskar and others, Pannekoek argued that the basis of science was found in human social life and practical activity. As an element in the general process of social development, science originated not so much from an abstract urge for truth and knowledge, but as a spontaneous practice born of social needs. Science, Pannekoek felt, was only one among many social activities arising from society and developing as other social activities do, in part autonomously and in part as a component of the overall structure of society. Although primitive societies are characterized by various forms of theoretical knowledge, science in the real sense of the word can arise only at a higher stage of civilization, with the invention of script, which enables practical knowledge to be transformed into scientific knowledge by establishing relationships between concepts. Through script, conceptions acquire an independent existence of their own, which allows them to be handled, stored, compared, and connected with each other. As conceptualized by Pannekoek, science was not only a special form of human thought activity, but also an integral part of the general social and economic process of a particular epoch. Within the framework of social development, science, quote, stands as a mental tool next to the material tools, and itself a productive power, constitutes the basis of technology, and so is an essential part of the productive apparatus, end quote. Pannekoek. Approached from this point of view, science represents a response to socially produced motivations and purposes and is based on socially stimulated modes of inquiry and explanation, a part of a larger mode of abstraction. Science has always reflected a particular epoch in its subject matter, its laws, its metaphysical propositions, and its embedded values. The new scientific, quote, truths that evolve out of each epoch represent an important and indispensable source of, quote, spiritual power, both for the development of new technologies and the new social relationships that arise out of them. Consequently, the emergence of a particular form of scientific consciousness or structure of ideas, cannot be separated from the social conflicts of its era. Quote, a new rising ruling class is able to understand through its particular class situation new truths that serve its interests. These new truths then become a powerful weapon in the struggle against the rulers of the declining social order, who have neither interest in nor understanding of the new doctrines and perceive them only as a threat. ... So it was with the natural science that accompanied the rise of the bourgeoisie, so too is it with political economy, which is a science of the proletariat. End quote. Pannekoek. Pannekoek treated it as axiomatic that the emergence of new forms of scientific consciousness entailed an intense process of, quote, spiritual struggle, in which new views are both counterposed to the old views and at the same time evolve out of them. The development of natural science in the 19th century, for instance, represented an expression of the growing historical self-understanding of an emerging bourgeoisie and a necessary precondition for industrial expansion. Quote, under the impulse of technical requirements of capitalism, the evolution of the natural sciences became a triumphal march of the human mind. Nature was subjugated first through the discovery of its laws by the human mind, and then by the material subordination of the known forces of nature to the human will in the service of our main object, end quote, of commodity production. Pannekoek felt that for these reasons, the natural sciences could be considered the, quote, spiritual base of capitalism, end quote. Pannekoek. While stressing the class origins of science, Pannekoek rejected the view that every class maintains its own special set of scientific doctrines. For Pannekoek, the point to be emphasized was that a certain form of science can be both an object of and weapon of class struggle, and that a class has an interest only in the investigation and diffusion of those truths which directly advance its own living conditions. Scientific ideas are therefore both classless and class-defined. Thus, while the natural sciences of the 19th century could be termed, quote, bourgeois on the basis of their objects and interests, they were objective in their cognitive achievements. Scientific objectivity corresponded to the class interest of the bourgeoisie and represented a powerful social norm. But for this same ruling class, Marx's doctrine of capitalist development represented a dangerous threat to their interest, and self-preservation compelled them to struggle against it and ignore its validity. For the proletariat, on the other hand, belief in the scientific validity of Marxism gives them greater power to struggle, and for this reason Marxism can also be seen as a norm of self-preservation. Both forms of science, therefore, aim for objectivity within their respective class frameworks. For the physical sciences, this meant that there could be no such thing as a, quote, bourgeois science to be replaced by a, quote, proletarian science. The question of a specifically proletarian science, he felt, was one of an entirely different form of historical consciousness. What a Marxist critique of science must be directed against, Pannekoek argued, is the class-determined ideological interpretation and class-determined practical utilization of science whenever it conflicts with the needs of humanity. By the same token, the methodology of the natural sciences cannot be used to criticize and improve Marxism. The real task is to use Marxism to criticize the role of the sciences in capitalist society. By this criterion, a sociological understanding of the origins and development of scientific ideas is part of a true appreciation of science. To the extent that socialism implies the further growth of productive forces, it also implies a corresponding growth of science. The science and technology of the hypothetical socialist future, no matter how altered, can only be based on all previous scientific and social accomplishments. To the principle of scientific objectivity, however, would be added that of social responsibility. New section: Social knowledge of a new kind. Pannekoek's concept of historical materialism. Pannekoek's synthesis of Marx and Dietzgen provided him with the intellectual tools to develop a conception of Marxism which was unique on the theoretical spectrum of the Second International. In Dietzgen, he found a major source of critical inspiration and an intellectual counterweight to the mechanistic Marxism that permeated the Second International. In theorizing his own conception of Marxism, Pannekoek's immediate aim was to develop a theory of knowledge and transformation which could be applied to the foundations of society. To achieve this, Pannekoek sought to incorporate into Marxism a new monistic outlook which would reconcile scientific materialism with the volitional qualities of human consciousness. At the most basic level, he felt this meant, quote, history is nothing less than the deeds and actions of men, but these deeds and actions must be willed, ... Marxism ... attempts to address itself to the origins of this will. End quote. Pannekoek. As initially conceived by Marx, the materialistic conception of history was meant to be an anti-metaphysical theory based on the evidence of human sense data, to be examined, quote, in the manner of the natural sciences, end quote. While the later writings of Marx reflected an increasingly positivistic trend, it was primarily Engels in his book Anti-Düring, and later his spiritual heir, Karl Kautsky, who generalized the historical materialism advanced by Marx into what came to be considered an extension of natural science. At the core of this methodology, which defined the Marxism of both the Second and Third Internationals, was a conception of the dialectic as the, quote, supreme science, governing the general laws of movement and development for nature, human society, and thought. Through this methodology, Marxism was increasingly transformed into a cosmogony, a total scientific synthesis of universal validity for all questions of social, historical, and natural development. While remaining firmly committed to the basic evolutionary premises of the classical Marxist paradigm, Pannekoek challenged the mechanistic and determinist form it had taken by attempting to retrieve the subjective and active elements in Marxism. In broad historical terms, Pannekoek felt that the, quote, new spiritual science, end quote, of Marxism, Pannekoek uses the term Marxism, spiritual science, social science, and historical materialism interchangeably, was both a, quote, theoretical expression, end quote, of a new stage of social development, and one aspect of the, quote, spiritual culture, end quote, of a new ascendant class. As the systematizers of the ideas and experiences of a rising working class movement, Marx and Engels were the first to transcend the limitations of bourgeois thought, and for this reason could be viewed as the, quote, first-class scientists of the proletariat, end quote. Pannekoek. At the same time, Pannekoek maintained that the set of doctrines collectively termed Marxism were themselves the outcome of a long process of active, quote, spiritual development, end quote, in which new ideas arise from conflicts with old ideas. Since, quote, every thinker can only work with the existing conceptual materials of his era, end quote, Marx's ideas arose directly out of the intellectual doctrines of the bourgeoisie. Marx's economic theories, for instance, were firmly grounded in the work of bourgeois economists such as Ricardo and Adam Smith, and his philosophical doctrines were largely a continuation of the revolutionary philosophy of the bourgeoisie. People would dispute both of those statements. In attempting to pinpoint the theoretical and cognitive possibilities of Marxism, Pannekoek argued that since all actions occur through the intervention of human consciousness, Marxism is a true, quote, science of human action, end quote, could only be based on a, quote, science of the human spirit, end quote, which Dietzgen had provided in his Dialectics of Distinction. Like the methodology of science in general, Marxist methodology must be based on a careful process of conceptual synthesis and clarification, in which existing conceptions are constantly dissected, compared, improved, rejected, and molded into new ones in a continuous search for greater unity and wider differentiation. In keeping with this view, Pannekoek maintained that the dialectic was neither a law of motion nor a specific scientific theory in itself, but simply a method of comprehending reality which finds expression only in the forms of conceptualization constructed by the mind. In this knowledge of properties lies the basis of prediction. For Marxism, this meant that social predictions must be based strictly on knowledge about the nature and development of capitalism. As early as 1904, Pannekoek specifically rejected Engels' three laws of materialist dialectics: transformation of quantity, interpretation of opposites, and negation of the negation, and declared that it was Dietzgen rather than Engels who developed the framework for a real Marxian dialectic. On the basis of his fundamental distinction between social and natural science, Pannekoek ruled out any direct connection between Marxism and physical theory. Quote, the spiritual sciences differ from the natural sciences not so much in their object as well as in their method, their notion of science, while the purpose of the natural sciences is to formulate, by way of abstraction from reality, a system of laws and formulas in which the universal is expressed. The purpose of spiritual science is to describe a given series of realities in such a way that the particularity and individuality of each reality is adequately expressed. Quote, Pannekoek. For Pannekoek, there were no doubts that Marxism was a science, but a science founded on the new theoretical object of social practice. There could be no such thing as deriving social theory either from or by analogy with physical processes, or conversely by reading social laws of development into nature. Nor was there any similarity between theory and practice in historical materialism and hypothesis and experiment in the physical sciences. Theory functioned not to unravel the laws of nature or the mystery of the universe, but to provide new levels of historical consciousness for a developing revolutionary workers' movement. In the same vein, Pannekoek insisted that Marxism could never be considered a theory of physical materialism. What distinguished physical materialism, or what Pannekoek chose to call, quote, bourgeois materialism, from historical materialism, Pannekoek maintained was its conceptual focus. For historical materialism, matter was essentially, quote, an abstraction, a concept by the spirit out of the phenomena which our sensations construct, end quote. From a methodological standpoint, this meant that, quote, historical materialism sees the results of science, concepts, substances, natural laws, and forces, although formed by nature, as first of all the products of the mental work of humanity. Bourgeois materialism, on the other hand, from the point of view of natural science, sees all this as belonging to nature, which has been discovered and brought to light only by science. Natural scientists consider the immutable substances, matter, energy, electricity, gravity, ether, the law of gravitation, the law of entropy, etc., as the basic elements of the world itself, as reality, which has to be discovered. From the viewpoint of historical materialism, however, these are products whose creative mental activity forms out of the substance of natural phenomena. End quote. Pannekoek. Pannekoek attributed the fact that Marxism had become identified with a theory of physical materialism to a fundamental misinterpretation of Marx's doctrines. What was most critical for Marx, he felt, was not the division between matter and spirit, but that between reality and fantasy. I actually like that. What was most critical for Marx, he felt, was not the division between matter and spirit, but that between reality and fantasy. This is a very interesting thing because this is corroborated by Z.A. Jordan, and I believe also by G.A. Vetter. I can't remember precisely, but definitely by Z.A. Jordan, who wrote the big book on the history of dialectical materialism from like the 50s, which is on this channel. But he argues that Marx cannot be meaningfully labeled a materialist in the philosophical sense of the term, but merely a naturalist, which basically is a more or less essentially a secularist worldview. Probing further into the scientific character of Marxism, Pannekoek moved to a specific examination of the nature of laws and predictions in Marxism. Pannekoek took the position that all science consists of doctrines and hypotheses which rest on differing degrees of certainty. All, quote, scientific truth, end quote, is therefore relative. It is considered the best truth of the moment, and it is part of a process of continuing development. It contrasts with, quote, dogmatic truth, which is based on, quote, primitive experiences, end quote, and is viewed with complete certainty as the final truth. On this basis, Pannekoek felt that it stood to reason that an even more tentative causal relationship between laws and predictions existed for the social sciences. Quote, through the immense complication of social relations, quote, laws of society are much more difficult to discern, and they cannot be put into the form of exact formulas. Still more than in nature, they may be said to express not the future, but our expectations about the future. It is already a great thing that, whereas former thinkers were groping in the dark, now some main lines of development have been discovered, end quote. Pannekoek. Indeed, Pannekoek had contended as early as 1901 that it mattered very little whether or not Marx's theories, or even his basic methodology, were completely valid, but that they produced results through practice, just as the natural sciences had continually produced scientific findings with wrong methods. Thus, just as the history of astronomy, for example, was, quote, full of predictions that did not come true, a disagreement that alarmed the scientists and had to be explained by new unforeseen circumstances, end quote, so too would be the new, quote, class science of Marxism. To speak, therefore, of Marxism as a set of absolute doctrines and predictions would be, quote, a half defeat, a laying down of one's arms, end quote. Pannekoek. Marxism, in Pannekoek's view, was a science to the extent that the social development and revolutionary activity which it reflects and seeks to explain requires the comprehension of its own subject matter, methodological concepts, and procedures. The conditional validity of its propositions depends both on the state of its external subject matter and the internal articulation and development of its own conceptual categories. From such a perspective, no statement about Marxism could ever be considered final. Marx's theories, and the social practice on which they are based, do not stand outside the course of social evolution, but undergo a constant process of transformation, development, and regression. In a broader historical sense, it was not the ideas of Marx per se that had the greater significance, but the fact that these ideas represented the first systematic formulation of the ideology of a rising revolutionary working-class movement. Marx's theories sprang from the recognition of an actually existing social movement opposed to the prevailing conditions, and they were expected to help this movement realize its own potentialities. The theoretical and philosophical formulation of ideas was, from this standpoint, not the basis of, but just the transitory ideological form of, the revolutionary class struggle. A Marxism ossified in the doctrines of Marx and Engels, Pannekoek felt, not only was not, but could never be a theory of proletarian revolution. In a cognitive sense, Pannekoek felt that the scientific categories of Marxism could only arise with and be understood by the proletariat, since it is the only class that has an interest in discovering the inner laws of society and can look at society in an unbiased manner. Marxism, therefore, was a science which allows the working class to see through the mask of bourgeois ideology and develop an understanding of its own revolutionary possibilities. Pannekoek insisted that what distinguished Marxism from all other past theoretical and scientific systems was the fact that it represented the first authentically popular form of scientific consciousness. Whereas for the bourgeoisie, science represents a system of abstract ideas and concepts to be used by intellectuals, historical materialism constitutes an integral part of the worker's own life experiences. For Pannekoek, what was to be stressed was that, for the workers, Marxism represented merely a form of, quote, ordered knowledge, a short summary of reality, end quote, based on their productive experiences, which both explains and clarifies these experiences as a guide to daily praxis. Quote, it is very unlikely that many of the socialist workers have ever read Kant or Hegel, and perhaps not even Marx, Engels, or Dietzgen, but they have something entirely different, life itself. It is their own life experiences which represent the study form which gives them certain convictions, end quote. Pannekoek. From the standpoint of its cognitive possibilities in the realm of daily life, Marxism represented a, quote, revolution in science, end quote, for which it would take at least a generation to fully comprehend. Pannekoek's most sustained effort to apply his concept of science in Marxism can be found in his treatment of the question of Darwinism. Few questions had more centrality to the ideology of the Second International than that of the relationship between Marxism and Darwinism. The inextricable link between Marx and Darwin had been given the firm imprimatur of Engels. In the works of semi-official philosophers like Kautsky, who in fact had initially come to socialism through his interpretation of Darwinist evolutionary science, Marxism was interpreted as an extension of Darwinist evolutionism applied to human history. Unlike most Marxists of the Second International, Pannekoek resolutely opposed all attempts to integrate Darwinism into Marxist doctrine. Pannekoek first addressed himself systematically to this question in his 1912 brochure titled Marxism and Darwinism, a work he considered to be among his best. Pannekoek's immediate practical aim was to combat On the one hand, the, quote, bourgeois Darwinists, end quote, who sought to use Darwinism as an intellectual justification for capitalism, and the orthodox Marxists, on the other, who saw it as, quote, natural proof of the inevitability of socialism. The basis of Pannekoek's analysis was outlined in his earlier distinction between natural and social science. Quote, the scientific importance of Marxism as well as Darwinism, end quote, he wrote, quote, consists in the following out the theory of evolution, the one upon the domain of the organic world, the other upon the domain of society, end quote. What this meant was that Marxism and Darwinism were completely independent of each other and should remain in their own domains. To carry a theory from one domain to another, where different laws are applicable, would necessarily entail wrong conclusions. This did not mean that they were opposed to each other, but that they supplement each other in the sense that according to the Darwinian theory of evolution, the animal world develops up to the stage of man, and from then on the Marxian theory of evolution applies. What was important in Darwin's work was the recognition that under certain circumstances, some animal kinds will develop into other animal kinds through a mechanism of natural law. The fact that this natural law became identified with a struggle for existence analogous to capitalist development did not affect the validity of his theory, nor conversely did it make capitalist competition a, quote, natural law. Their differences between Marx and Darwin were just as significant as their similarities, and the failure of Marxists to recognize them was a major weakness of their scientific position. In drawing out the political implications of his analysis, Pannekoek argued that Darwinism, like all scientific formulations, was not mere abstract thought, but an integral part of the class struggles of its epoch. In this instance, Darwinism functioned as a, quote, tool of the bourgeoisie, end quote, in its struggle against both the remnants of feudalism and the proletariat, by undermining the entire foundation of orthodox Christian dogma. Darwin's theory destroyed the main ideological prop of the opponents of bourgeois rule, but Darwinism worked equally well for the bourgeoisie as a weapon against the proletariat. By seeming to offer, quote, scientific proof of inequality and teaching that struggle is unavoidable, Darwinism served as a powerful counterweight to the socialist doctrines of equality and cooperation. What Marx and Darwin really had in common, Pannekoek felt, was to shatter an old, rigid, and mobile worldview. For socialists, therefore, the real significance of Darwinism lay in the fact that it represented a precondition for understanding historical materialism rather than a doctrine readily related to it in any way. In attempting to establish a more authentically scientific basis for Marxism, Pannekoek stressed repeatedly that his effort represented more than a purely intellectual inquiry. From Pannekoek's standpoint, Marxism, although clearly an objective science, was not intended to be above values, but had an obligation to serve the practical aims of the class struggle. Like science in general, the goal of Marxism was explanation and practice. The doctrine was only a medium to this end. Marx's aim, Pannekoek argued, was not to proclaim doctrines about social organization, but to clarify social events as a prelude to action. Theory for Marx was above all partisan, and had meaning only as an indivisible and essential part of social transformation. His theory sprang from the recognition of an actually existing social movement opposed to the prevailing social order, and they were expected to help this movement realize its full potentialities. Pannekoek's early efforts to restore the active and conscious dimension in Marxism represented an advanced and insightful early critique of the mechanistic and fatalistic tendencies in orthodox Marxism. Perhaps more than any other Marxist theorist of the years before 1914, Pannekoek recognized the failure of Marxist orthodoxy and set out to establish the conditions under which an authentically scientific and transformative Marxism could be realized. But at the same time, this effort was seriously weakened by the ambiguous and even contradictory nature of many of his insights. For example, in attempting to specify how scientific knowledge about society might be obtained and applied by the socialist movement, Pannekoek remained at a high level of generality. In many cases, the terms, concepts, and premises that he employed to analyze the main components of Marxism were either exceedingly vague or lacking in clear application, to the extent that their practical effect was often reduced to the level of platitude. He constantly assumed as correct, without examining or proving, key assumptions which were central to his analysis. There is, for instance, nowhere to be found in his work even the slightest questioning of the scientific validity of Marxism. On the contrary, he always went out of his way to defend Marxism as a, quote, scientific weapon of the working class. Left with these shortcomings and ambiguities, Pannekoek was often compelled to revert to many of the very tendencies he sought to reject. For all his emphasis on the relative and tentative validity of all forms of knowledge, Pannekoek's Marxism, with its conclusive, quote, scientific truths, end quote, and laws of development, had a powerful sense of finality, of having discovered truth or at least the way to truth. The result was that his attempt to revitalize Marxism as a theory of transformation ultimately floundered. And that's the end of the piece as such. Let me see what's happening here in terms of endnotes, because it did have endnotes. Yeah, so these endnotes are pretty involved, so I am going to read them. The most comprehensive account of Dietzgen's life and work is Gerhard Huck's Joseph Dietzgen, 1828 to 1888. I think it's a German book, published in 1979. Also useful are Eugen Dietzgen's article, Joseph Dietzgen, A Sketch of His Life. In the book, Joseph Dietzgen, Some of the Philosophical Essays on Socialism and Science, Religion, Ethics, Critique of Reason, and the World at Large, published in 1917. Adam Buick's article, Joseph Dietzgen, Adam Buick being of the Socialist Party of Great Britain, whose work I cannot recommend enough. Also, a German book by Adolf Heppner, titled Joseph Dietzgen, Philosophische Lehren, published in 1916, and Henrietta Rolandhorst's book, Joseph Dietzgen, Philosophie gemeinverständlich erläutert in der Bedeutung für das Proletariat, published in 1910. And obviously, Henrietta Rolandhorst would be, or be a comrade of Pannekoek. She was part of Dutch left communism. I think she went on to be more interested in like religious questions, became like a religious Christian or Christian of some kind, if I'm remembering correctly, but I'm not exactly sure. And footnote. Marx qualified this enthusiasm, I'm assuming, for Dietzgen by noting a, quote, certain confusion and a, quote, too frequent repetition in a manuscript Dietzgen had sent him. And footnote. Quote, and this materialist dialectic, which for years has been our best working tool and our sharpest weapon, was remarkably enough discovered not only by us, but also independently of us and even of Hegel by a German worker, Joseph Dietzgen, end quote. Friedrich Engels, in the book Ludwig Feuerbach and the Outcome of Classical German Philosophy. Although he termed Dietzgen's quote, account of the thing in itself as a thing made of thought, and quote, as quote, brilliant, Engels complained that Dietzgen's use of the dialectic appeared, quote, more in flashes than as a connected whole, end quote. That's from a letter Engels to Marx, November 6, 1868. End footnote. Footnote. In this connection, George Lichtheim has noted, quote, on the whole, he probably came closest to expressing what the average socialist of the period thought and felt about the world, but his thinking was too unsystematic to yield the kind of coherent doctrine that could be opposed to the official teaching in the universities, end quote. George Lichtheim, in the book Marxism, A Historical and Critical Study, published in 1961. That I'm assuming that quote is in relation to Dietzgen. And footnote. Footnote. An examination of certain aspects of Dietzgen influence on rank-and-file militants can be found in two works by Stuart McIntyre. The article Joseph Dietzgen and the British Working Class Education, published in the Society for the Study of Labor History, 1974, and the book A Proletarian Science, Marxism in Britain, 1917 to 1933. And footnote. Footnote. Pannekoek noted in this connection that it was, quote, a proof of the deep validity of a clear Marxist insight that Dietzgen, a layman and an amateur in the scientific area, fully clarified the basis of modern natural science long before the modern natural scientists themselves went the same way. The most well-known of them, Ernst Mach, had admitted his astonishment upon learning that many of his newly developed theories had been developed a quarter century earlier by Dietzgen. End quote. Pannekoek. Throughout his career, Pannekoek consistently attempted to apply a Dietzgen methodology to his own scientific research. End footnote. Footnote. Pannekoek's most comprehensive discussion of the relationship between science and social development is contained in his book A History of Astronomy, 1969. Footnote. Pannekoek, Leninist Philosopher, A Critical Examination of the Philosophical Basis of Leninism, 1948. Pannekoek has elaborated elsewhere on the concept of technology. Quote, the basis of society, productive power, is formed chiefly through technology, though in primitive societies natural conditions play a major role. Technology does not merely involve material factors such as machines, factories, coal mines, and railroads, but also the ability to make them and the science which creates this technology. Natural science, our knowledge of the forces of nature, our ability to use it and to calculate with it, may be conceived as factors of production too. Technology rests on material factors alone, not on material factors alone, but also on strong spiritual elements, end quote. Pannekoek. By analogy, Pannekoek viewed socialist politics as the, quote, technology of the proletariat, end quote, since it had a similar scientific and spiritual connection to their productive relationships. From 1908 to 1914, while a full-time militant in the German SPD, Pannekoek wrote a regular series of weekly articles which were sent to subscribing local SPD publications. The dates cited are those of the proof copies contained in the Pannekoek archives. These articles can be found most regularly in the Leipziger Volkszeitung and the Brennerberger Zeitung, usually several days to several weeks after the proof date copy. Okay. Footnote. Pannekoek argued that the dialectical mode of thinking provides truth only through its relative character. Quote, dialectical thinking corresponds to reality inasmuch as it takes into consideration that the finite cannot explain the infinite, nor the static the dynamic world, that every concept has to develop into new concepts or even into its opposite, end quote. Pannekoek. Footnote. Pannekoek later claimed it was on these grounds that he never studied Marx systematically. I don't know who he is, if he's referring to himself or to others. Okay, so that's all the end. That's the end of the footnote, the endnotes. Thank you so much for listening. Again, this is Chapter 2 of Anton Pannekoek and the Socialism of Workers' Self-Emancipation by John Gerber. Chapter 2 was titled where am I? Mind and Reality, Pannekoek's Methodology, with the headings Pannekoek and Dietzgen, The Dialectics of Distinction, Theory and Social Development, The Class Basis of Science, Social Knowledge of a New Kind, Pannekoek's Conception of Historical Materialism. Chapter 3 of this book is titled The Dutch Left Marxism in Formation, The Nieuwe, Tijd, left, 1899 to 1906. Thank you so much for listening.